We asked Bliss back to Missoula after having had her at our last year's Families and Learning Conference. We had this incredibly positive response to her keynote address and the work sessions that followed, and everybody was like, bring her back, bring her back. During the work session, we sat in this large circle, passing a smooth stone, much like a talking stick, and we felt invited or even more compelled to share information with each other, and it was just such a wonderful process, and to be able to learn that process and share that process again, I think is so valuable. So, folks told us that they were hungry to get more strategies like that, and that they wanted more ideas on how to start conversations and fodder to take back to their communities. So we invited her back, and we're really glad we did. This morning, Bliss met with a group of Missoula businessmen and women, and they were some owners of small businesses, some banking execs, some nonprofit managers and corporate people, human resource officers from businesses, and folks from just a wide array of the Missoula community. And this is, the kind of work that we're talking about having happen, and they may not have had anything in common, but she probably captivated their imaginations, and I've heard they had great conversations, and that it was a really successful event. And I don't think that most of them knew what they were getting into or what to expect when they came, but I think they left feeling really good about the way they'd spent their morning. They may not really even have processed yet what they learned this morning. They may go home this weekend and think about it. They may share it with a family member. They may go back to work Monday and really realize what they are taking away from that session. So just keep thinking outside the box and keep imagining. And I will ask you to join me in welcoming Bliss Browne from Imagine Chicago. So.
I've discovered, first of all, it's very nice to be back. And secondly, one of the things you discover when you give keynote speeches, I'm an extrovert, so I don't remember tomorrow what I speak about today. But people who are listening to you often do, which means that fortunately for me, I never give the same speech, but I do have some favorite stories. And so I decided this morning that one of the disciplines should be to think about something I haven't thought about in a very long time, so that I wouldn't have thought about it last year, in case any of you were here last year. And then, to think about what to talk about. And I'm doing a workshop immediately after this, and I decided that I really would focus these on two different things. So if you've come to hear about really frameworks for inspiring change, I've decided to do that in the workshop. So I'm sorry if you came to hear about that, because you're not going to hear about that now. But what I thought I would do instead is really share with you both some reflections that emerged out of this morning on how this really connects, because I tend to like to deconstruct life, meaning in simpler language, to really think about things from a very simple human point of view. Like, why do we learn, and why do we bother, and why does it matter to connect schools and communities? Not in a sort of instrumental way, but what are we trying to accomplish in terms of the human project? So what I've done is written a few remarks in the last 3 hours, which I may or may not refer to a single time, but to really begin thinking through myself this progression as a mother from home to school. For those of you who understand social construction, and social construction quite simply just says, the way we see and the way we speak and the way we think has everything to do with the relationships that have formed us. because children come into life without a preconceived notion of how to make sense of it, but hardwired as human beings to make sense of it. So in every encounter, we're always refashioning how we see. And what that means is that learning is really at the heart of everything. It also means that you leave this conference a different person than you arrived, because you've learned to see differently. You've learned a different map of what's possible. So I started thinking this morning, knowing what the topic was for this conference in particular, specifically about school community partnerships. You know, what they are, how they are, why they matter, about my own experience with that. And maybe for those of you who don't know about Imagine Chicago, I should just say a word about what Imagine Chicago is as well. You may know I spent many years as a corporate banker. I've also, for 35 years, been ordained in the Episcopal Church as a deacon and then a priest. And I'm the mother of now 3 young adults. But I had those children when I was functioning in a dual life as a banker and a priest. And those worlds don't have a lot in common in terms of the way they see life, the language they use, their worldview, what they say is important, how life is organized. But as a mother, one of the things you have to do for your children is to help make sense of things. You know, so when your children say, "Mommy, what do?" You say, "I'm your mom." That should be obvious. Yeah, but what do you do when you're not here? Well, a lot of stuff. You know, like, why do you do that, Mom? You know, and you have these conversations, and in the process, you're not only explaining facts, you're interpreting life. You're saying life can be a certain way. And Imagine Chicago really emerged out of a deep sense that, you know, when I was looking at the lives of children in our city of Chicago in the early 90s, that we were losing a lot of kids. They were killing each other, they were drinking themselves to death. And, you know, I really began to wonder if it might not have something to do with our having divided up the way people think. That maybe, just maybe, that things were much more united at their core, that life had a kind of generative willingness to find life, to survive, to adapt, but that we had spent an awful lot of time and energy dividing the world up in ways that, yes, reinforced power and privilege and maybe some useful organization, but that also over time had become awfully unuseful in many, many dimensions. And so I simply got possessed by a question of, how do we help people think from the whole? And over the last now 18 years, Imagine Chicago has really been dedicated to cultivating hope and civic engagement. Now, what that really means when you say cultivating hope and civic engagement is, first of all, looking for what's alive. What's alive, what has meaning, and what has meaning in life in a way that's orienting, because that's what hope is. And secondly, engagement, figuring out how do we get along in a way that enables us to move in the direction of those hopes, of that intention, that sense of purpose, that sense of value. So as we began to do that in Chicago, one thing we realized is that if we were going to help people think from the whole, that we had to reconnect the dots in a way that people trusted. And that meant, especially if we were concerned about kids' lives, that meant building partnerships that were intergenerational, that were intercultural, because we have a very divided city, and we've institutionalized those divisions. So that we had to bring things back together, so that when people looked at what was going on, they said, you know, this feels, this feels whole, you know, and that also was, it both seemed important and to many people impossible to do. which got me then thinking about the role of imagination. And the role of imagination because we can never do what we cannot imagine. So I used to say, isn't it curious that we thought nothing as a city of inviting the world to a World's Fair in Chicago 20 years after our city burned to the ground, but we can't imagine an end to racial division? Why? Why? What's shaped our imagination collectively to say certain things are possible and other things are never going to be possible? One of the things I loved about Barack's candidacy and election was that it took off the table the possibility of a person of color being president. Because now in Chicago, we don't have any school children that will grow up thinking that's not possible, because it's happened. And then more becomes possible for their lives. Even the question of who they can become was different the next day in the Chicago public schools. There wasn't a teacher alive in Chicago that week that didn't have that as the content of what was being taught. Why? Because in that moment, a new possibility emerged on the scene. Now there, just that single example, is a school community connection. Something so compelling going on outside that you can't help but bring it into school. So those are some ways of thinking about what Imagine Chicago's work has been, which has really had been to build creative partnerships that cross all kinds of dividing lines that people haven't thought were possible to cross. But curiously, when I really think of Imagine Chicago, I think of Imagine Chicago as a child. And I really mean that. I think about it so much as a child that I'm actually spent 4 years writing a book about this. And there were 2 reasons for that. When I went on the retreat, after I left the bank, and that's a whole other story that you heard last year and I'm not retelling, after I left the bank to begin what became Imagine Chicago, I went on an 8-day silent retreat, thinking, I certainly hope I figure out why I just left a very good job that paid all the bills. And what emerged out of that retreat was simply one clear word out of my own prayer and reflection, which was think like a mother. Think like a mother. This is a child of grace, and her gift is imagination, and she'll be a delight to other children. This is not, if you've spent your life as a strategic planner in banking, this is not a strategic plan. But what it is a kind of invitation. And as I'm now looking back almost 20 years later, I really started looking at the trajectory of my own work in the last 20 years from that exhortation to think like a mother, and started thinking about, why is it that thinking like a mother is what shifts the social equation? Well, certainly it has everything, I think, to do with, and I'm saying mother here as opposed to father only because I'm a mother and not a father. But I don't think it's different. I don't think this has to do with giving birth in your body. I think it has to do with a kind of perspective. And the perspective goes something like this. First of all, I have alive and growing and changing every day a child who is not under my control and who changes every day, and for me to be in dialogue with the promise of this child's life, I have to be present every day to something new which can't be known until it's here. And I have to, in spite of the fact that this person grows and changes and isn't under my control, although certainly under my influence, I have to create structures over a whole lifetime in which they come to see their lives as purposeful, as meaningful, as having promise. And to develop that promise of their life, which is held in potential when they're little, but over time gets realized or not, depending on many, many things. Their capacity to build relationships with people, their capacity to love, to belong, to master skills, to think independently, so that they're able to be in life in a way that is both confident and competent. Well, that's a huge, huge job. That's a huge job. And it seems to me that the whole debate, the whole attention of the world right now on sustainable development, and the Imagine movement is now, it's a global movement all over the world. But the largest Imagine projects in the world now are large cities, Durban, Calgary, places like that, focused on sustainable development. Imagine Durban, Imagine Calgary. And really what they're focused on is exactly what mothers think about in a family. How do we keep the system organized and directed to what is life-giving over the long term in a way that really honors and reverences this promise of life? That is what sustainable development is about. And how do we take what we've learned at home to do that work? Well, learning begins at home. There's no doubt about that. Among other things, because parents really carry both that initial and ongoing responsibility for shaping the primary frames of reference out of which the child sees. Now, that's as simple a thing as a parent saying to a child, "You can do that." Or a parent saying to the child, "You're so stupid, you're never going to figure that out." Those sayings, those things which we say sometimes cavalierly, are actually creating a world of meaning and identity. Identity. So one of the challenges is that parents have to, on the one hand, just at a very basic level, provide for things like health and safety, which, as we know, is a really considerable thing to do all by itself. Let's say you're a parent who has really decided that organic eating is really what you need to do to make sure your child doesn't die of cancer. And then your child goes and the school lunch program doesn't look like that. What do you do? What do you do? And I mean those examples not at all in a silly way, but to say at a point that a child is no longer at home, you have already set up for the parents a huge thing to negotiate in terms of the kind of values the child is learning and in terms of who the child is becoming, what they're being taught about life and who they are and what they're capable of. And you're entrusting that essentially to strangers to do for a large part of the day. Any parent who has had an exceptional teacher for their children knows how thrilling it is when you realize that your children are better off in their care than they are in your own. And, by the same token, you've had the teacher where you thought, oh my goodness, there was all this damage happening and I had no idea that it was going on. We found out when my only brother was in the 2nd grade that he had been put in the hall every day because he had been drawing what the teacher said were swastikas. He had no idea. It was a pattern, and she said she would have no little Nazis in her class. And then would bring him back in to take exams, and he would fail the exam, and she would put him back out in the hall again. Well, you think, how does a 7-year-old make sense of that world? Now, that's an extreme example in many ways, but one of the things which is so challenging as a parent is that really what you have to be about is not only shaping a world in which your children are safe enough, but a world in which they're safe because life makes sense. And often in a world in which, as parents, we are ourselves struggling with whether life makes sense. So, what do we say to our children that's true? That we are willing to remember tomorrow, that we can remember because we trust it, and also that gives them the tools for life to make sense. And then enter school. So each school, like every family, is quite different. It doesn't matter, public, private, Montessori, every school is different in how it shapes a child's understanding of life. And really based on what it teaches, based on the context it sets up. You go into a Montessori school, which my children all graduated from, and you can just tell by the shape of the room that this is a different school environment than a school I went to in which desks were nailed to the floor, and in which if you had my maiden name began with W, I knew I would be in the last seat in the last row before I ever walked in the room. That was how things were organized. Some schools think of what they're doing as basically teaching a set of knowledge. Others concentrate on, a capacity for creative thought. Others a Montessori school says, follow the child. And they do that within a multi-year learning community, 6 to 9, 9 to 12. Other schools segregate children by age, and they teach them by memorization, or by methodically instilling precepts, mathematical precepts, religious precepts. I have 2 children who live in China. You go into a Chinese school system, and I sat in the company of a 5-year-old who had the Taoist sayings in front of them. It was a 90-page textbook of sayings, and he could recite the entire book by memory at age 5. And if I started on page 47, he could start on page 47 and recite it going forward from page 47. And I thought, oh my goodness. Sort of what is the process by which this child has developed that kind of memory capacity at that age? So, parents homeschooling their children, but choosing the educational context for the child is one of the most important choices a parent makes. And often, at least in Chicago, a choice that parents have less and less choice over, or perceived choice over, depending on how much money they have. So in Chicago, the public school system is the school system by default if you're either not engaged with your school or you can't afford education. It's a kind of third-tier school system, not because it aspires to be, but because that's the way the system over time has developed. Well, what happens at school, of course, is in a good school, a child really develops capacity for meaningful thinking and a mastery of a whole range of necessary personal and intellectual and professional skills, and an ability to evaluate a multiplicity of approaches and disciplines that shed light on important questions. So let's look at life, and today we're going to look at life through the lens of biology. And tomorrow we're going to look at life through the lens of a frog's view of Chicago history. And tomorrow the next day we're going to look at life through the lens of mathematics, or play, or design, or whatever. But what we're trying to look at is life. Life. What it is, what makes sense, why it matters, and why we matter to it. So to develop in a child a sense that they matter and that the choices they make matter. And to give them the confidence that no matter what lens comes at me, that I have a way of thinking it through, I have a way of responding to it in light of my own values and beliefs. I have a way of listening to you and standing at a point of conviction myself without being threatened by who you are. And when a child has a rich learning environment, and I would say also adults who listen to how they make sense, then they develop a huge capacity to understand and shape life in an original way, because they're making all of those connections, and because learning changes the learner. So learning at its best develops the capacity to take constructive risk, because that's what learning is. You know, an ability to change what you believe and see in light of a greater truth that you just learned and chose to assimilate. So you then have these two things, home and school, as the primary context in which children develop their identity as learners, their mastery of skills, and I would say also their mindsets as citizens. So it's where children, both of those contexts are where children learn either to see narrowly or broadly, to express themselves well or poorly, to participate or to withdraw, to think independently or to conform, to see their own lives as successes or failures. And the great majority of children learn in public schools. So as a foundational institution with responsibility to develop the capacity of children, public schools' ability in particular to educate students and stimulate their imagination and interest in learning, I think has maybe almost the greatest impact on any community's future. But and you know, to say it simply, high quality public education is essential, foundational to high quality public life, which is why the school-community partnership matters everything. It's also why it matters as a citizen to ask over and over again the question, what is the mission of public education? What should they contribute, public schools? What should they contribute to a child's confidence in life, to their competence as a citizen, to their ability to make constructive choices? What is a school's responsibility for developing the wholeness and imagination of a child, or a child's joy, especially joy in learning? Should it socialize children into patterns of conformity? Should it be accountable for forming obedient citizens or discerning citizens or creative citizens? What is its relationship to preparing people to be productive workers? I don't think that these questions are rhetorical. I think they're on the table, what the purpose of public education is. And in the United States, and I must say I spend probably 11 months a year abroad, so I have a lot better perspective at this point in the last 7 years on how the rest of the world is organized and working or not than I do my own country. But in the United States, which is an extraordinarily prosperous country, most public schools, and I certainly can say this is true in Chicago, can only afford or perceive that they can only afford to offer a standardized educational curriculum, and that they lack resources to cater to the particular needs and learning styles of individual students. And increasingly, they are also overburdened with operating as default social service agencies. So it's a considerable challenge, and I have nothing but the deepest respect for teachers, nothing. I worked with them very closely for 7 years, and it's easy to understand why so many feel they've been set up to fail. Because it is an almost overwhelming challenge right now to bring learning alive in schools which lack even basic budgets for books and supplies, and have increasingly tenuous connections among teachers and between teachers and parents in local communities. So many teachers are demoralized. And demoralized teachers doesn't create a good learning environment for students. And not surprisingly, in my view, many students have dropped out of school. My Indian friends call this, they said, you know, how would it reframe the education debate if we started thinking of school leavers as conscientious objectors? I mean that's a very provocative question. And so in India, they held a conference of 400 kids that have left school and said, you know, we're thinking of you as conscientious objectors, and we really, really need to learn from you what education needs to be that would bring learning alive for you. And it was an incredibly powerful thing to do. But anyway, you know, I think many kids who drop out of school drop out because sometimes it's a kind of passive pedagogy with which they're not engaged, but often a lack of imagination about linking academic content to broader life issues that are of much more immediate concern to them, which is to say, school doesn't make sense. It connects to things that I don't have in my life, that I don't understand, that I can't connect to. And to say this in academic terms, at least in Chicago, the real crisis is fundamental literacy. And literacy here, I mean not decoding words. Literacy at its heart is about taking information and organizing it in a way that makes sense. You know, if I put a mark on the board like that, you know, if I just write that, what do you see when I just wrote that? What do you see? A 1? Anybody else? What do you see? A line? Okay. Now, let's say I take this, I've written this, and now I write that. What do you see? See a 10. And you know, you see a 10, and if I wrote it and you wrote it up on the board and I said, don't look at it as a 10, it would be really hard for you to unsee the 10. Because boy, it took all those years in school to learn that that's what it was. Now, if I wrote a Chinese character up there, most people in this room would say, looks Asian. But most people, it wouldn't be meaningful because it doesn't have any frame of reference for you. That's a convention. The fact that that means 10, it's a convention. We learned that along the way. So when our students can't read, when parents can't make sense of things, it's because there's a lot of information there that I can't figure out how to put together. Sometimes it's marks in space, and I don't know how they relate to each other. I don't know what it means. Sometimes I can say the word and I don't know what the word means. It's nowhere in my life. So, but the challenge about improving literacy is that if students can't read, meaning they can't make sense of information coming at them, then they can't connect to what they're expected to know, then they can't imagine the world beyond their immediate circumstances. And then, you know, television, for instance, becomes a much more dominant shaper of the collective imagination. They have less tools because they have less lenses, less ways in to seeing how the world might make sense or might be organized. And without the tools to understand science and social studies and technology and environment and politics and health, then their chances really diminish for obtaining living wage jobs or participating as constructive citizens. And we do know that children who fail in public education are at high risk to develop social pathologies and to suffer from poorer health. So, public schools are really, really critical strategic allies in shaping a better future for communities. So how do you, those of you, I know you're many educators in the room, reimagine your futures to connect to students' learning to the transformation of school, to the transformation of the block on which the child lives, to the transformation of the community in which the child lives? And how can families become effective literacy partners? Again, literacy meaning making sense out of information, connecting it, asking about it, thinking it through, and help their own children make sense of life in school, even in cases where their own experience of education may have been limited or negative. So it may have shut things down. So that's all of those fundamental questions are really what encouraged Imagine Chicago to devote 7 full years to building school community partnerships. And I'm just going to tell you a little bit about that story. In 1996, Chicago Annenberg arrived, and there was a new national funding initiative to address challenges of size, time, and isolation in public schools. And with their support, Imagine Chicago was the largest Annenberg grantee in Chicago. With their support, we developed a 6-year collaborative partnership. And I'm going to give you this just as an illustrative partnership, not to duplicate this kind of a partnership, but here were the partners. We had 6 world-class museums: the Field Museum, the Aquarium, the Botanic Garden, the Museum of the American Indian, which I put in there because I really wanted a local cultural perspective, and I live in a neighborhood in Chicago that has a lot of Native history. But these museums came in as partners. We had a university partner, namely the DePaul Center for Urban Education, which is one of the best places in the country to look at learning in context. And they have a fabulous website, which I can give you. And then 8 Chicago public schools. And the 8 Chicago public schools were either co-located with public housing or they were in new immigrant communities. And so the balance of families in that school in those schools were about 60% African American and about 40% Latino, the Latino population being the fastest growing Chicago population. And the idea here was to take Imagine Chicago's fundamental approach, which summed up hugely simply is just understand, meaning understand the best of what is, see what works and build on it, imagine, take what you understand and use it to stretch a sense of possibility about what could happen, and then do it, create. And create by working together out of what you've now imagined could be possible, create it in a way that really expands imagination and participation about the future and gives people a sense of hope and belonging. You know, you can count on the fact that people want to belong and make a difference. You can count on that all over the world and every community in the world. You know, that we're hardwired for that. That's a huge advantage in doing human work. So how could we, in this case, get teachers, administrators, and parents all serving as change agents to revitalize schools through an asset-based approach to planning, the integration of visual interactive learning into the curriculum, the renewal of teachers and their vocation as teachers, and a parent literacy program to really read the city, read Chicago as a learning context and bring it home. Our simple thought there is, first of all, if you want to address size, time, and isolation, if we can take every school, and every one of our schools was on probation, meaning they were in the bottom 20% of the schools. In fact, one of the schools had 3% of their kids reading at grade level. That is almost a statistical impossibility, to random, 3%. But anyway, so these schools were really, really in desperate situation in terms of academic achievement. However, you know, again, you can reasonably assume that people will do the right thing if they know what to do and how to do it. You know, there is no parent there who is just dying for their kid to fail. You know, kids want to succeed and their parents want them to succeed. And teachers want to be good teachers. So if you can find a pathway into that. So what we said is here we have, first of all, and this is important in thinking about partnership, the first thing is you have museum, school, university, Imagine Chicago. So the first question on the table, and this would be true of any partnership, is to say, what is it you must achieve, central to your mission this year? And then let's figure out if there's a way we can do that together, in a way you couldn't do as effectively on your own. That's the key to successful partnership. So I said to the principals, what must you do? And they said, we must improve reading. This is completely a crisis. And then we said in museums, what must you do? And they said, we must shift from being curatorial institutions, meaning we protect objects and keep them for you, to being educational outreach institutions, because if we don't, we're going to have to close our doors. And we said to DePaul University, what must you do? And they said, we have to be effective probation managers of schools on probation. We really have to figure out internally how schools can succeed. And Imagine Chicago just said, we want to really develop active citizens who have choices and exercise them in a strength-based process. So we put that into the mix on the table and then said to people, okay, so if that's what we're trying to do, how can we do it? And we spent a full year, and I think partnerships take time. That's not a negative. It's a design principle, in the same way that you don't build a bridge by Monday, just because you have to have it by Monday. You take the time to build it, because when you're building bridges, there are things that you have to do right for the bridge to work. And I think it's the same way with partnerships. So we spent that year sort of saying, you know, what would this really look like? How is the school currently organized? How is the museum currently organized? And what do you look like when you're operating at your best? You know, all these years later, 15 years later, I can still remember that opening meeting when we said, bring an object with you that shows you at your best. So why do that? Because museums care about objects. And now we already have a school museum, you know, connection. But I'll give you an example of how this played out over time. We would say to the kindergarten teacher, what must you teach your children this week? We must learn colors. Okay, how do we do that in a way that's going to really bring learning alive for the kids? It's going to be fun. And it's going to also connect to your museum partner, who is the Botanic Garden this year. So the museum, the Botanic Garden comes in, works with a school, and plants a prairie garden in what was a drug and rubble-strewn lot in the middle of the school. They plant a prairie garden. They learn about seeds. They learn about the prairie. With third grade talks about life on the prairie. We learn about Chicago's history. Every grade gets involved in replanting the prairie inside the school. And it provides now a safe space in a very dangerous neighborhood for kids to congregate. But now we're back to the kindergarten teacher. So kindergarten teacher takes every single child, goes out into the prairie garden, and says to Lakeisha, Lakeisha, see if you can find something in the garden that's yellow. And Lakeisha says, the corn is yellow. She says, tell me a story about corn. I love popcorn when I watch TV. Fine. So now Lakeisha is the curator of the color yellow. And we take Lakeisha's picture, and we take a picture of the corn, and we underscore the color yellow. And then we laminate that page. And now, Lakeisha is the curator of the color yellow, and Marla is the curator of the color green, and LaDonna is the color black, etc. And now, not surprisingly, everyone in kindergarten wants to read the color book, because they're in charge of the colors now. And they've also been out in the prairie, and they've noticed the colors in the prairie. Now, that's a very simple example, but that's a very strong school community link. You know, you've now linked the children to the history that brought Chicago into its ascendancy in the Midwest. You've linked it to the future of sustainable development. We're replanting prairie gardens all over the city, not only in that school. And in the meantime, the teachers have been at the Botanic Garden learning about a dimension of their own science that they didn't know about. So, you know, you can imagine that if you could systematically apply that sort of framework, this understand, imagine, create, where you're always looking for what works, you then start bringing that into the way people talk to each other within the school. One of the schools said, okay, we need to look at how this is happening within the ranks of teachers. And they decided to take as their little petri dish the teacher lounge. And so they conducted an experiment of what conversations happened in the teacher lounge and discovered that most conversations in the teacher lounge at that moment consisted of complaining about children. So they said, or the principal, whatever. And so they said, all right, one of the commitments we're going to make is that in this lounge, the only allowable conversation is what happened in your class today that really worked. And over time, it was a very different teacher's lounge, almost overnight. So you can imagine that as you begin to build these partnerships, you also then ask the question, not only what's working, but what needs work. And by year 3, clearly what needed work was that parents had to be in the equation. We didn't start off this partnership with parents involved, and largely because the principals said, parents don't care and they won't show up. But everyone recognized the importance of developing the school community partnership. So here's what we did. And again, I know we're at the end of our time and people are wandering away and we have workshops to go to. So I'm going to tell this story quickly. But in that parenting thing, we said, how about we take the parents into the museums, but then we organize the curriculum around what the kids are learning in school and what parents need to be organizing at home by way of a family budget. So we organized it around transportation, education, energy, water, recreation, housing, income, food, the things that were foundational in a family's life, foundational in terms of the public agenda and what was being debated in the legislature, and would be familiar to every single family, no matter how educated they were. And we developed a process of asking questions which took the stuff of everyday life and then connected it to the biggest possible ideas. And we said to parents, we know everyone here is a good reader because you're reading me right now. And we know that you're committed to helping your children read. So what we want to do is to refresh your understanding of various connections about how to create a culture of learning in the home so you can help your children read. And that took it out of the category of a remedial course for parents who didn't know how to read, and into a course for effective parents that were committed to improving their children's education. And month by month, we had a big meeting at a museum, food at the Field Museum, looked at through the lens of Africa and whatever. And then we had a skill-based thing at the school. And so the skills, the competencies related to food included being able to read a food label, understanding special diets, nutrition, including the Latin American food pyramid, etc. Transportation, core competency is map skills. Can't use any transportation system if you can't read a map, like that. But anyway, those bringing it home workshops turned out to be very, very powerful. And mainly what we discovered at the end of that, and that is really the closest I've ever come to watching transformation happen day by day, was seeing the lives of those families. In fact, I remember Pauline Browne, who was at Suter School, and a parent saying, I remember starting this year just thinking about the world and how it is and what harm it could bring to my children. But she said, now I get up every day and think, what greatness can I bring to the world? And that was worth a lot. So I want to just summarize that what we learned out of this was that what made the program work, and this was a 7-year process. The first thing was focusing on the future, meaning asking the question of who we want to become and why, and really focusing and organizing around that which had meaning and purpose for the school and for the participating institutions. The second was strengthening vital connections, not only through that sense of purpose, but by treating people exceptionally well. And many of you heard me say last year, in every single interaction, every single time we speak, we are either adding and contributing to a culture of blessing or a culture of curse. We're either cutting people off at the knees and telling them they don't matter, or we're enhancing their sense of possibility about life and about their own competence. So if you think, if you can imagine that you have 8 Chicago public schools in which it becomes a religion how you speak to one another in the teacher lounge and in the classroom, and how you develop the imaginative capacity of parents and students, that was a revolutionary sort of thing to do. So that constructive communications, and then really expanding how we saw the learning context. So to see Chicago as a learning context, to see home as a learning context, and to see school as one piece of a continuum of a learning context where you could take the content of what was going on in school and really weave it back and forth with what was going on in everyday life. And in that, learning and practicing always asking big questions and caring a lot more about the questions than the answer, trying to really entrust leadership to people within the school, and really seeing parents as I would say partners of choice, as empowered partners. And that, again, you could count on that being problematic precisely because a lot of schools were threatened by having parents be empowered, because then parents had something to say about the way the school was run. So for those of you who are interested in really some of the process, out of all of this after 20 years, I finally sat back just this year and said, what have we really learned always works in any context? School, community, Denmark, South Africa, Chicago. What works with human beings when you're trying to inspire a sense of connection and change? And that really is what I'm going to do the workshop on this afternoon. But what I can say about this school community thing is that when you have really a clear sense of purpose, in this case it was improving reading, and the courage to really ask the fundamental questions behind that, what is it and why does it matter? And then what specifically can we bring by way of our own strengths and commitments and skills to doing that? Not because we should, but because we want to, and because our children are worth it, and because we want to give our gifts, and we have a lot of them to give. Those very simple things really can profoundly shift even what appears to be the most intractable of systems. And I've seen in this state over the last 3 years so many examples of that working. And I'm going to leave with this story. L.J. Bird. Do any of you live in Browning? Do you know, I got involved with L.J. Bird, who was 12 years old, in our Citizen Leaders Program. And I say involved because this is a compelling human being. And in the first day of this program of saying how you want your community to be different, he was on this, he said, we need to pick up the trash in our community. Because you know what? People drive through our town and they see the trash and then they think we're trash, and we're not trash. We're a strong people. And so he organized a community cleanup day. And he decided that he was going to get his buddies at De La Salle School, and these were the 9 to 12-year-olds, involved in the community cleanup day. The housing authority heard about this, and the housing authority said we could waive the dump fees for the day if you did a community cleanup day, because we'd love to see kids get involved in that too. And then LJ said, kids aren't just going to do this because they think it should be cleaner. Kids do it because they think it's cool to have a competitive sport. So we need to have teams with backpacks and snacks in order to make this really high competitive sport. So we organized teams with backpacks, LJ and his buddy Tyler doing this whole thing. They organized this, and in the space of less than 2 hours, these teams picked up 2.5 tons of trash in less than 2 hours. And you sort of look at that, and the other project also run by kids and their teachers out of that De La Salle school was, if you've driven through Browning, this 60-foot community mural that you now see. And they wanted to paint a mural so people could see what they were about as a community And then we said, how do we bring that into the classroom? Said, you know what? Every day we could talk about what a community is. Every day we could do that. And then we could start thinking about the images, and then we could draw that, and then we could blow it up, and then we could paint it. And then when people come into Browning, they're not only going to see that this community is cleaner, they're going to see who we are as a community. And both of those projects were done by young children, simply in response to what kind of community do you want to have and what can you do about it. So I think this, a lot of structural changes need to happen, but often it's just asking people the question and then standing back and saying, let's do it, we can. Thank you.